The first thing I do when I start grading an image is I work with the luminance, making sure that my brightest areas are as bright as they should be and the dark areas hit just where they should be. The reason I do this is that in an RGB or red, green, and blue color space, the brighter you make an image, the less saturated it appears, and the darker an image, the more saturated it appears. So I want to make sure that my luminance is perfect before I start tweaking the color. So the first step is to make sure that the image isn't overexposed or underexposed. So let's say you're presented with an image that's either under or overexposed. It's very easy to fix in the Lumetri color effect. I'm going to select the clip. I'm going to look at my waveform, and you'll notice that there's not a lot of information above about 75%. And if I look at the image, I'm losing a lot of the information in the shadows. And I can make adjustments to the luminance with the exposure slider. I'm going to go ahead and just slide this over to the right just until it hits 100. Now, that is broadcast safe, but if I look at the image, her skin tone's too washed out. As a matter of fact, usually skin tone should be at about 70 IRE. So I'm going to pull this back and I'm going to have it top out somewhere in the 70 area, and you'll notice this is where her face is, and this looks pretty good. I may dial it down just a little bit, but I've taken a dark image and I've made it look better. Now, the best thing to do when you're color grading is to switch back and forth between the original image and the corrected image to see how far you've come. So I can go over here to this little checkbox in the upper right-hand corner. With a simple click, I can look at my original image and look at my fixed image. And this is really nice because her face is less in shadow. Now I may want to tweak this more with some fine tuning, and we'll look at that in a later lesson. Now, what if you're presented with an image that's too bright? Well, it's the same solution, just the other way. If we look at our waveform, we can see we're hitting 100, but our blacks are nowhere near where they should be because they're at around 10. So I'm going to, again, go back to the exposure adjustment, pull down my luminance, just about there until her face is at about 70 IRE. Once again, we look at the before and we look at the after. Obviously, the before was a shot that we couldn't really use, but the after is quite acceptable. Now, in addition to working with luminance, I also work with the contrast of an image. If we go to the next image in our timeline, we see this low contrast shot of this vehicle going across the desert. And it's really easy to see that it's low contrast by looking at the waveform. You'll notice that the darkest area is running around 20 and the brightest is almost hitting 65. I want this to be as wide as possible. To fix this, I would use the adjustment slider for contrast and add more contrast to my image. As you can see, when I widen the contrast, the image starts to pop, and on the waveform, instead of being as narrow as it was, it actually now dips down to almost 0 and goes up to about 70. Now here's a little trick with the Lumetri color correction effect. Your slider may go to 100, but if you actually click on the numerical value, you can move it to the right all the way up to 150. So you can even extend it a little bit more. Now, as I said in an earlier lesson, Adobe limits the amount of correction you can do within the Lumetri color effect. If you needed to expand this contrast even more, there are additional controls in the other sections, as well as the option to use any of the color effects from the effects panel. The last shot we're going to look at is an over contrasty shot. And if you look at the waveform, you see there's a lot of information at the very top and a lot of information at the bottom. And there's information here, but it's pretty stretched out. So again, we're going to use the contrast slider. We'll bring that all the way down to the left. And what this is doing is putting more information in the center. And if I wanted to reduce the contrast even more, I can do the same thing I did with fixing a low contrast shot. I can click on the numerical value and tighten it up. Again, the best way to see the success of your correction is to turn it off and then back on again. So that really shows me no detail in my shadows. It just feels kind of crunched. There's no information in the blacks. The whites are just kind of muddy. So with a simple fix, I can see a much greater dynamic range. Now you notice I use this checkbox to enable and disable my correction. But one thing I usually do when I'm color correcting is once I've done all my corrections and I want to see what the original looks like, I'll load the original inside my source monitor by simply pressing the F key, and that's going to match frame to the original clip. So now I can see on the left side the before and the right side after. And we'll do it just one more time with our vehicle shot, F to match frame, and as you can see, the image on the left doesn't pop, but the image on the right does. Color correction doesn't have to be moving lots of sliders around and working hours on an image. Sometimes it's as simple as correcting the luminance and the contrast, and you're ready to move on.